this is where you really have to start to plan. And when you talk about starting to plan, I think that this is really important. We just talked about all of the pre-planning items that help you be able to then think about what do you actually need to do in the plan.
And this is where your time commitment changes, right? So I said change is the fourth piece. Time commitment was the second piece. Continue going on. But This is one of the big things that we've realized is the preparation to do one of these episodes.
Yep. So now you think about your audience. Okay, so what's your niche? What are you going to be in? What are the things you're going to talk about and discuss, and how are you going to create and deliver content to them, right?
Yep.
And for us, we knew we didn't necessarily have a niche to start. We knew we were going to find that. We were going to shoot some episodes. We were going to bring people on who we thought were influential. And then we were going to see how the episodes really started to evolve and get listens and everything else. And then we were going to start to tailor the content towards what has been doing well.
Well,
right?
and audience feedback.
Absolutely.
They're
audience
looking for
feedback.
something. Yeah, absolutely. We're engineers in general.
Yeah,
Feedback loops, baby. Feedback
absolutely.
loops.
And it wasn't just people that had influence. It was a lot of people that had something good to say. Like we had Dragos on, talked about building a custom home. I mean, I would say that almost everybody would like to build their own custom home, right? How many people actually can is a different story.
So what is our niche? Is our niche interviewing entrepreneurs and people who are doing cool? Is our niche technology?
Or is it the WAC team
is our niche us?
Is it late night fun stuff? Like
exactly.
Who knows?
And so we didn't necessarily know. So when you talk about that plan, we said, okay, we know our audience is generally going to be entrepreneurial. It's generally going to be somebody who's looking to do a side hustle, maybe somebody interested in finance, technology, self-starter.
Yeah.
So usually have some health and fitness in their life. Yeah, a variety of
right.
Yeah.
And
gotta keep that brain healthy.
And so we said, okay, so we had some traits of our audience, and we knew we were going to have to refine that. So we moved on to the next thing.
So we shot a shotgun in the dark, not a sniper rifle. Go.
Right. And because we didn't really want to lock ourselves in too much to something, but we knew we were going to be committed to doing this because we had a lot to share collectively, WAC as a group. And so now you've knocked out the audience, and we said, okay, so what's the type of content and what are the messages that we want to deliver? And the content and the message is really important because that's where you and I and Wally sat down and we had some introspection, and we basically said, okay, for these episodes, what's our body language like? What's our mannerisms like? Are we doing a good job passing the conversation around the table? And, we had to figure out how we work and how we operate well together. And then once we sort of had those ground rules, we really had to come up with the structure for the podcast because there's...
Alan, we have a problem. I lost the conch.
Yeah, you lost the conch.
I can't find it.
Yeah, Lord of the Flies, for those of you who don't know that reference.
And I wouldn't say it was rules. It was more so, it was like a mutual respect for us on this podcast and delivering something that's, ear candy and eye and ear candy to those that are watching, where we're trying to bring value that somebody can plug into our show and basically have a team if they didn't have anyone. And so for us, in order to deliver the best experience, we all had to change and evolve to contribute the most value to the show.
And then so now you're talking about episode planning, right? Yeah. And this is really where we said, okay, for episode planning, we had to understand do we want this to be really kind of like structured and rigid? And, do we want to have everything sort of pre-mapped out? And it's like, okay, we're only allowed to talk about these questions and these topics about these questions.
That was never going to fly because I'm not giving an interview on 60 Minutes or being somebody from CNN or Fox News or blah, 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 blah.
What we realized was our episodes have to be aligned with something we're passionate about, something we have experience and professionalism with, something we have...
Or an interest.
Or people we know who are doing something really good or have done something really good in that space.
And we bring them on the show, and then we basically let them tell their story and tell their experience and tell their entrepreneurial journey. And then we're able to then ask very strategic questions to build more understanding.
And so we knew for the structure of our episodes, we really had to have... Instead of like a big outline of everything to ask, we knew we only needed to have like 5 to 7 topics that we generally knew we needed to get the conversation steered towards organically. And I think that was really important because it allowed us to have some structure because depending on who we brought on or what the topic was that we were talking about, it allowed us to hit on the key points. And then because why podcasts are so popular is for that in-depth, long-form content.
That's organic. It's very organic.
Right. And there might be a topic that is really, really important to discuss in some depth and in some detail. And then others, there might be, it might be a little bit easier to, just touch on the high-level pieces. And so that's for us how we went about planning our episodes. And now that we're not saying that would work for everybody, but when we looked at our audience and what our niche could be, we had to then build our episode plans and our episode content accordingly. And I think that was really, really, really important, because then the next thing was reps.
So what I hear you saying is the plan was more like an approach, but not a finite way of how we were going to do something.
Correct.
And so it allowed us to be prepared for what we are going to do, but allow the organic nature of the conversation to go in the direction that it was going to flow in, where then we knew what were some of the ways that we were going to supplement or extend the value we're getting from each of those segments.
Correct. Because if you are just you're hosting a podcast and you're just talking about certain topics and you're going through sort of different subjects,
yep,
and that's not aligned with your why, or your process of shooting episodes is not aligned with what you want to do or how you want to do it. What's really important in my mind is you're not going to have your personality come out. You're not going to have your differentiation come out. You're not going to have that thing come out that people really like about your podcast. And so for me and Wally and you, it was really important that was included in our process. And so I would actively encourage everybody, when we talk about getting started, it's really important to get those reps under your belt and figure out, how do you make sure your why stays in and comes out through the podcast?
Making sure that you describe who you are.
And you don't over-structure everything. But this is actually a really good point, because when we talk about podcast planning is just as important as the podcast, sort of script or key topics we try to talk about. Because before we shoot the episode, we definitely are making sure that we have a discussion beforehand, 10, 15 minutes about key talking points, so on and so forth, that we like to go through. And for me, that's just so incredibly important, because then it sort of gets us comfortable with the topic and it allows our personalities to come out. And then we sort of have like this pregame to the episode. And I feel like that is so, so, so important, because your identity in doing a podcast is more important than the subjects you talk about. Yep.
Oh,
so
did I lose? Okay, there you go.
There you go.
I think I might have got muted for a second. Dang, I lost my privileges there. I couldn't agree more. Allowing yourself to shine through on your podcast and your identity to shine through is really what makes you you and unique in who you are. And I feel like we took some of that adoption as well from, you had found the YouTube formula.
Great book, by the way.
That we had all read. It's on Audible if you want to listen to it, via your ears and not your eyes. That was a mandatory read for everybody here on the WAC Attack team. And we all took it in and embodied a lot of the things that were in there, almost all of them. And we come from a heavily data structured background and an analysis and analytics background. So, the back half of that book for us was just repetition of nature we already know. But the first half of the book was really about how being authentic and knowing your audience is really what will drive the most value for you. So we talked about the inception, and then the planning,
the why, the planning,
the
getting reps underneath
introduction,
you,
the learning, the reps.
Let me talk about more of the process, because remember I said earlier, it's really important to get some reps and to understand your level of commitment before you go into the process.
Yes.
So I talked about,
elaborate on that for us.
I talked about the niche in the audience. I talked about the episode planning and making sure that you don't over-structure episodes to where your personality and your identity doesn't come out anymore, right? You want to make sure you keep that in there. But then there's also the technology side of things. You have to understand how podcast distribution works. So you have podcast channels, right? Think Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio.
Let's put some context around this really quick. So when you talk about podcast planning, I feel like you're making a pretty large, you're casting a pretty large net. Why don't we break this down into a couple smaller segments? So if we're going to shoot a podcast, what is the pre-preparation planning that we're doing? Go.
Well, the pre-preparation planning that we're doing is, like I said, we're meeting with the team beforehand. We're going over the topic. We have agenda items, talking points we want to get through. And we're not over structuring or making the podcast super rigid.
Do you do any, if we're bringing somebody on, do you interview them at all in that process?
Oh, absolutely. We interview them in that process. And that's all a part of that episode planning, right? That's all a part of, that conversation that you have. And
who's involved in that process? Is it just you and the person, or is producer Scott involved?
Well, pre-planning, I think what's really important is to come up with that list and review it. I mean, there's always a process pre-planning that we do. We plan episodes out. We have those in Jira tickets. We go through key.
If you don't know what Jira is a project management software. It's highly technical.
And so, we have key talking points that we go through. We review that before we ever have a studio set up or anything, or we have the studio on for a shoot and guests there. We make sure we have it all aligned with what we want to talk about. And then when the guest comes in or the three of us come in, we talk about the topic we want to discuss. We have that sheet that we review, and that's sort of in the pre-planning, like I had talked about.
So we've got out of the pre-planning, and you've kind of got into the second phase. So now let's talk about when somebody comes to the studio. What are some of the things that you've learned and that we've adopted, maybe from a cultural perspective here at the WAC Attack podcast, that when we have somebody come in, what do we do for the first 30 minutes before we shoot the episode to really get things ready?
Yeah. The biggest thing is you got to make sure that the environment is comfortable, and you got to make sure you got a good way to take the the edge off of things.
Is that like a drink? Is that like we share a meal together?
Well,
what is that?
Sometimes we have drinks out here. Other times we have meals here. I think meals and a drink is a good way to sort of loosen things up. If you have a guest on, I definitely like, getting there a little bit early, having a meal there if you're shooting later at night. It gives you an opportunity in sort of like a non-stressful setting to have some conversation and like to start to get to know each other's personality, because you do have to vibe really well with the guests when you're on screen with them.
Oh yeah, you really have to.
And the dinner beforehand really helps out. Just, pro tip, bring a toothbrush or a toothpick. But on the opposite side of things, right? That's why I said you got to get some reps in, and you have to sort of make it interesting, because if it's just you talking all the time about the same subject, and you're not like a really authoritative person, you're not a really well-known person in the industry, like it can get fairly repetitive and fairly boring. And so, that's why I said having your ability to have the identity in the podcast is really important. So that's on the episode side and the episode shooting side. I want to talk more, and I want to get into the nuts and bolts of what you're actually going to need to be successful in the podcast. We've given you our experience.
So just hold on a second. I'm going to get there. I have one more follow-up question. So I think you talked about the culture piece, right? What is it like when somebody comes on the podcast here? What's the culture? We usually have a meal. We share some drinks. We talk a little bit about generally where things are going. There's also some guidance around, hey, if you're not comfortable talking about certain things, this is stuff you brought up, Alan, or if you're not comfortable talking about certain, numbers, maybe speak in like 7 figures instead of millions. And then when we actually have the episode, okay, we basically use all of that as our playbook. So the episode's over. Okay, what are the things that we're doing before we leave for the night at the studio?
I mean, the things we're doing before we leave at the night, we always shoot the intro of the podcast at the end of the podcast. I think that this is a great take, because you don't really know where the conversation's going to go. And like I said earlier, we generally have topics we like to touch on. Sometimes we don't get to all those topics, but we might get to a few really good ones that we didn't plan for, because you can't plan for an organic conversation.
No, like when Trump shows up.
Yeah. In the Batman voice. And there's some funny aspects to the episodes we shoot. But at the end, we'll sit there and we'll do the intro. Hey, on this episode of WAC Attack, we discuss our experience starting a podcast and the process for how you can start your own podcast and launch it, right? We shoot those intros. That's fun. We also try to shoot something a little bit more engaging, a little bit more funny for social media. And those have been really good for us because we do the video podcast.
Do we script those out at all?
No, we don't script them out.
They're by the seat of your chair.
Yeah.
And do you have more than one person do them?
Yeah, we try to have as many people do them as we can, because you never know who's going to have the best one. We just sit people down in the seat, we spitball it. And sometimes there's really great stuff that comes out.
Oh my God,
Other times,
Wally's I see the smudge on your screen. You were dying when he said that a few weeks back.
Yeah, that was a pretty good one.
So we get all the media collected. Okay,
Right.
We've shot all the video, we've done the introductions, and we're done for the night. One of the things that we don't have to do is we don't have to tear down the studio, but we do have to turn the studio off and leave the office. What does it take from the time we leave the office to the time somebody is listening to this podcast? What does it take to get to that step?
Yeah, very good talking point. So there is the episode post-production that you need to consider, okay? And then
what
there's
is post-production? Break this down for us.
I'm going to get into this. And then there is, after the post-production, there's all of the tools and platforms that you need to distribute and disseminate the podcast, okay? Let's focus on the post-production right now.
So post-production is editing?
Right. It's going to be editing. If you have a video podcast, it'll be video and audio. If you just have an audio podcast, it'll just be audio, okay? So really important here to understand that if you are an audio-only podcast, you are literally sound in somebody's ear. If your audio does not sound great, crispy, flawless, like it's coming out of a studio in a beautiful voice, here's what you need to consider. You need to consider having some type of tool like Adobe Premiere and a plugin that automatically cancels out background noises, makes your voice sound a little bit better, makes it to where you're going to be crisp and clear and clean. And so I actively encourage you to do some research on that. Now, that's a tool that you're going to need for post-production. We use Premiere for the video side of things. We are doing live switching here. And on that live switching, we're doing all of the cuts, everything right here. So we're not having to do all of this crazy video editing behind the scenes because producer Scott, shout out producer Scott, is actively doing all of the video switching. And so we have that file when it outputs to a single file.
As a quick sidebar to that, Adobe also has their Adobe Podcast AI tool. So if you're an audio-only podcast, you can, if you're using crappy mics, which we really hope you're not, you can use that tool, and it really cleans up your audio to about 90%-ish of the professional.
So now let's talk about the hardware and the considerations that we had for this post-production. Originally, we had SM7Bs because we have those at work.
SM7Bs are made by who?
They're Shure.
Okay.
Shure microphones are the same ones Joe Rogan uses. Very, very popular. And we had those at work for office setups, because we are virtual consultants and we want to make sure our audio sounds really nice. But what we found is they were a little tinny, basically meaning in the lows, they were kind of like, the lows weren't very sharp. They were kind of flat. And so
if the lows weren't sharp, give an example of that really quick.
I can't give you an example of it because our audio engineer is so good that our audio sounds great most all the time. And so we ended up going with these Earthworks microphones because they have some extra hardware in here that helps with the processing. But what we also did on the audio, because we didn't want to do any post-production audio, is on the Rodecaster. And this is actually one of the reasons why the Rodecaster is pretty good for, introductory podcasts, is you can actually go and customize all of the settings in there for like noise gates and lows, mids, and highs. And it just gives us a lot of really crisp audio. And so to me, that's really, really important because we wanted to minimize our post-production time because that takes the most amount of time, more time than shooting the episode. So you need tools to do that. You need computers to do that. You need hardware to do that. It is a lot of equipment to make that happen and to make that work. And also, you don't have to use the Adobe products. There's plenty of products out there that you can use. If you're doing virtual podcasts, you can use like Riverside FM, stuff like that.
For a virtual podcast, I think it's really important that you get quality microphones.
Yes, but if you're doing a virtual podcast, here's the challenge, right?
What about the people you're having on the show?
Right.
Yeah.
And, if you have a guest and they call in and you're doing a virtual podcast, like, for example, the Rodecaster can actually have somebody call in on a phone and it's hooked up via Bluetooth, and that can record out directly to the audio channels that we're in. And so these are all considerations, your why, your audience, who you're going to have on, how you're going to do this. That's why we said you need to really understand that before you get into this process. So now let's say you get done editing and you get done doing everything that you need to do for the podcast episode. Now the podcast distribution platform, you need one. That is basically where you store all of your audio or video files for your podcast.
Okay.
You give name, description, etc., episodes, season numbers of the podcast. And there's free and premium platforms that you can use. And there are some very key things to consider here because, one, you're going to want to figure out how do you want to monetize the podcast. Do you want to be a middleman to where, a third-party ad network can display ads in your podcast? Spotify is really great for that with Anchor FM. Now it's podcast for Spotify podcasters. But there's also other podcast distribution platforms that host all of your files, and then they distribute them to all of the networks. So you will have to create an account for Amazon Music, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, so on and so forth.